Hey everybody, I'm Mark Payne. I'm one of the co-creators of Apache NiFi, and over the past 5 or so years, I have worked with teams from some of the largest companies in the world to help ensure that they're making the most out of their use of Apache NiFi. Now, some of the use cases that I've seen are really simple, maybe grabbing a few files off of an FTP server once a day and pushing those into HDFS. Some are far more complex, receiving millions of events per second from thousands of different sources, doing some analysis and some enrichment, maybe doing some transformation, and ultimately routing and sending that data to hundreds of different destinations. But across all of these different use cases, there are certain practices that I see come up over and over again that really prevent NiFi from reaching its full potential. I call these practices anti-patterns. And in this video series, I want to show you some of these anti-patterns and what we can do to avoid them to help ensure that you're not running into the same problems. So let's get into it. So in part 1 of this series, I talked about 3 different anti-patterns. I talked about splitting and remerging data. I talked about treating structured and semi-structured data the same as unstructured data. And I talked about blurring the lines between flow file content and flow file attributes. Today, we're going to talk about flow layout. Now, no developer wants to inherit a code base that's just an absolute spaghetti mess. It's true of code and it's true of a data flow. If you have a data flow that's just all jumbled up and messy, it presents several different problems. First of all, it's hard to understand. You can't really follow the flow of the data by looking at the UI. And if you can't understand it, it definitely makes it difficult to update and to maintain that flow. But it also makes it really hard to onboard new flow developers and maintainers. Nobody wants to mess with a flow like that. But when I ask a customer to show me their data flow, more often than not, I see something that looks a little bit like this. Now, if I talk to the customer and they tell me that they're having trouble with data that's arriving in Kafka from this published Kafka processor, one of the first things that I'm going to do is ask them to explain to me the flow of the data through their system. How does the data get there? And whenever you look at a graph like this, it's really kind of difficult to understand what's happening. But as I've talked to users, there are really 2 reasons that they so often lay out their flows in this way. First, they just haven't really taken the time to sit down and think about what's best in terms of laying out their flow. How should it look? And second, there are a lot of tips and tricks in the UI to help you with laying out your flow that may not be obvious to everybody. So today we're going to fix this. I'm going to show you a handful of different tips to keep your data flow clean, simple, and easy to understand. So let's start by talking about the flow direction. Now, you can build your flows going from top to bottom or from left to right. You can build them going bottom to top if that's what makes you happy. But I found that most people tend to align their processors from the left to the right in this manner. Now, they typically do this because I think the screen is a lot wider than it is tall, right? But the processors are also much wider than they are tall. So it's very common whenever you talk to users for them to expect that left to right is going to give them the most screen real estate to deal with because their screens are wider. But the reality is that you can stack many processors vertically and get a lot more on the screen at one time. And then you don't have to deal with the connections overlapping with your processors like this. So typically whenever I look at a flow like this and I want to start reorganizing it, I'll start at some point, just grab one of these processors and I'll just pull it over out of the way. Just pull it over to the right here. And at this point, we can grab the source or the destination and start moving those over as well. So at this point, we've kind of started this linear approach going from top to bottom, but they're not really aligned very well. And so one thing that we can do to take care of that is that we can zoom out using the mouse's scroll wheel. And then if we hold shift, we can drag an area across the canvas to select a bunch of components. Then we can right click on those components and go to the align menu, either horizontal or vertical alignment. And in this case, I want to use a vertical alignment. And that's going to go ahead and line up all of those selected components for me. So now we can go ahead and start moving over more of these components. But we can see here that the compressed content is going in two different directions. We've got a success and a failure. So in this case, what I typically do is I'll go ahead and start creating a divergent path, basically, to the left or to the right. And so that way we have basically the main path going straight down, and then the divergent paths also moving straight down, but offset to the left or the right. You'll see what I mean in just a moment. Now at this point, we've got these components are a little bit too close together because you'll see that their labels start to overlap. And so we can either move these components further apart, but now we start to take up a lot of our screen real estate. So the other option is that whenever we select this connection, we can double click that connection, and that will give us what we call a bend point. Once we've created that bend point, we can go ahead and start bending that line however we want. If we then double click here, we can create another one, and then we can start making shapes that make sense for our data flow. If we decide we no longer want this bend point, we can just double click it to remove it. So this way we've got these two different input ports. We can keep them pretty close together, but that bend point allows us to draw the connection much more cleanly so that they're not overlapping each other. And we can see that we've got some of these connections going from the route on attribute processor to this log attribute processor that are coming way over here to the left. And that's just because we have these bend points already added here. So we can remove those bend points. But now in this case, we've actually got two different connections going from route on attribute to log attribute. Now, there may be reasons that we want to do that. For instance, we may want to manage the back pressure independently or something like that. But in most cases, what we can actually do is to just configure this connection, either by right-clicking, going to configure, or just by double-clicking it. And then we can just select all of the different relationships we want for this one connection. And now we see this one connection has both the medium and priority relationships, so that we can get rid of this other connection. It'll just help to keep our canvas a little bit tidier. We'll continue to pull these components over. Get rid of some of these breakpoints because they don't make sense for us anymore once we've moved these components. Again, we can just iteratively move these components around to make a little bit better sense of this data flow. And if we add a bend point there, and now we see that in a couple of cases here, we have this connection going from this processor down to this output port. And this connection is really overlapping our process group. It's overlapping some other components. So this is a great use case for adding some bend points. we might add a couple of them so that we can just kind of route around that process group. And again, we'll do the same thing over here. I'm being a little bit particular about my bin points here. There are certainly different ways that you can lay these out that would make a lot of sense. Just kind of depends on your personal taste here. But at this point, we've now aligned these components much more clearly. It's a lot easier whenever you look at this put Kafka processor to understand how the data got to this point. Well, at least in terms of how it got here once it came into this process group. You can see the steps that it took to get here, for instance. But it still doesn't really tell us a lot about what the flow is doing, or more importantly, why the flow is built the way that it is. So take, for example, this identify MIME type processor. Well, clearly it's going to identify the MIME type, but why in the world would we want to do that? Well, in this particular case, the reason it's done is because we just want to check to see whether or not the data is compressed. So if we configure this processor, we can give it a name, check if compressed. The next thing that the flow is going to do is it's going to use a compressed content processor. But we're not really going to compress that data. If you look at the properties, we can see that the mode is set to decompress. And so this compressed content processor is built to work really nicely with that identify MIME type processor. So the identify MIME type will determine whether or not the data is compressed. And then this processor will decompress it, but only if it is compressed. Otherwise, it'll just send it directly through to success. So we'll call this decompress if necessary. The next processor in our flow is replace text. So again, obviously, we're going to replace the text in the flow file. But what are we changing and why are we changing it? Well, I happen to know, and if you look at the properties, we'll see that we are searching for this particular pattern, $, curly brace, and then we're replacing it with a $, And so this is done because some of the sources that are feeding us data have a bug in them that's actually using the wrong value there. And so in our settings, let's give this a more descriptive name. But in addition to changing the name, we might also want to leave some comments about this processor. And then we can apply these changes. Now at this point, you'll notice that this replace text processor has this black downward arrow. And if we hover over that, that's actually going to show us those comments that I just typed into that box there. So now as you're looking at this flow, you're able to tell not only that we're replacing text, but that we're fixing some corruption. And hovering over this is going to give us even more context, whatever those comments were that I left in that processor. Next, we're going to look at a route on attribute processor. But again, we can be a lot more descriptive. We should be talking about, well, what are we actually routing on? In this case, we're routing on a priority field. And it's going to go down this path or down this path. And in this case, we have a put JMS processor. Again, we can be a lot more descriptive. Well, where are we putting it? clearly to JMS, but in this case, it's going to go to the My Destination topic. Similarly with publish Kafka, we don't want to just say that, okay, well, we're publishing it to Kafka, but we'll say put to other destination topic. Or we might want to describe the particular Kafka brokers that we're going to push to if we have more than one Kafka cluster that we might want to actually push data to. Whatever makes sense for your particular use case. But the idea is to give these processors names that are really descriptive, that make it easier to understand how the data flow was meant to behave. And it really serves as documentation, both to other people who are being onboarded onto the flow, as well as the people who develop the flow when they come back to it a couple of weeks later and they forget the different decisions that they've made at the time. And so one other thing that we can do whenever we're building these flows to provide more context and documentation is that we can actually drag these labels onto the flow. And we can double click to configure that. And here it's just an open text field, whatever we might want to type in here. So let's make it larger, and let's say we're going to remove these once the source of the data is fixed. Right, so that gives us the ability to just put some blob of text right onto the canvas for documentation purposes. But we do want to be careful that we don't overuse these, because most of the time it makes more sense to leave comments in the processors themselves rather than to clutter the canvas with all of these types of labels. They can be useful at times. And so now if we zoom out, which we can actually do by using this icon over here to fit everything onto the screen for us, and we can click this icon to zoom into the actual zoom level or the one-to-one zoom level. But we can now step back and really look at this flow, and we can see how nicely aligned it is. We know that the processors have descriptive names. They have comments where applicable to describe what's actually happening in the flow. We've got an absolutely gorgeous data flow at this point. It's clear, it's concise, it's easy to understand. And it took all of 10 minutes to rearrange everything to look this way. Now, of course, if you've got hundreds or thousands of processors, it'll take longer than that. But you'll also reap 10 times the benefits whenever you're reorganizing a really large, complex flow. So don't just watch me do it. Go on, try it. And when you realize how much better this is, don't forget to come back and like and share the video, and subscribe to the channel. Cheers.